when you get more advanced into photography, a wide angle lens will deliver a different perspective than a telephoto lens, but I'm not going to talk about that. Or processing programs like Photoshop, other programs like that. Again, this is really just a basic class to teach people how, or to teach you how to see a scene and record it on a camera. So the ground rules for the class today are ask questions and I will answer it. I've also, with an hour, we've got time at the end of the presentation for me to answer questions as well. And have fun. My mentor always told us that the 3 rules of photography were have fun, be creative, have fun, and follow the assignment. Not necessarily in that order. And I've been having fun with photography for more than 30 years. So just a little bit about me. Most of you at Highlands know that I was the director of university relations for 15 years at Highlands University. I left 6 months ago, I believe. And as Julie said, my wife and I are living in Tbilisi, Georgia, where I've been busy taking photos and writing books. But I have a background in editorial photography. Before I worked in higher education, I published magazines, wrote for magazines, took photos, worked at a daily newspaper. So my original degree way back when was in photography, back when we still had to use film. So with that said, let's go. So one of the things that people believe there's in the photography community, there's kind of a, people call it GAS, G-A-S, and that's gear acquisition syndrome. And it's this belief that in order to take a good photograph that you need all kinds of photo equipment and gear to take a good photo. And that's really not true. As an example, I took this photo with my cell phone. Corey and I were walking around, and it was a day that I didn't have my camera with me because we were running errands, and came across this church here in Tbilisi and just opened my camera. And it's not even the good iPhone, it's the basic iPhone SE. This was taken in Trompas, New Mexico a few years ago. I just had a basic point and shoot camera. And when I say this, people always ask me, why do I have a backbreaking amount of gear then if you don't need that? And there's a few reasons. The older I get, the less gear it takes to be backbreaking. And I sell images on my website and stock photography for editorials. So there's a need for a higher resolution and more clarity. And I'm a guy, it's how we roll. And I asked my wife saw this when I was putting it together and said, well, that's not really true. And I told her, well, if I took up another hobby, would you be concerned? And she said, yes, that if I took up golf or something, she would know that I would spend a bunch of money. So, oops. Sorry. One question that I get frequently that some people might be wanting to ask is, what kind of camera should I get? In every presentation, somebody's asked me this. It's really like asking, what kind of vehicle should you buy? It depends if you need a truck, a car, a minivan. There's so many different types of cameras that I can't really tell somebody, get this camera or that camera. Like I said at the end, I'll give you my email address. If you want to email me specific, if you are interested in looking at a camera, I can point you in a direction. But it's a much more difficult question than it seems, and that's why I'm going to get it out of the way now. So there's one key to taking important photos, and usually in classes I have everybody kind of guess what that is, but since we're all on mute, I'm just going to tell you. It's curiosity. And that's the one thing. It doesn't matter where you're at. Find something different. Go out and see, even if it's your hometown, if it's in an area that you've been in for 30 years, there's always something different if you take the time to really explore and look and use some of the techniques. When I worked at Highlands, I had a work study student tell me that there's nothing interesting to photograph in New Mexico. And I thought, you've got to be kidding. We've got great history, amazing architecture, picturesque towns, mountains, plains, and you're telling me there is nothing to photograph in New Mexico. And part of it was she was born and raised in New Mexico, and she kind of lost that curiosity. But when you go out and you start exploring things and seeing things in a different light, you'll find that your photos actually improve. So we're going to jump into how we see a photo. And this is interesting because I started doing these before we moved to Georgia. And I did a workshop a few weeks ago. There was some people from who grew up speaking Arabic. And if you grow up speaking English, this is applicable. But if you grew up speaking Arabic or Japanese or another language that isn't written from right to left, you actually see photos and visuals differently with that. But as English speakers, we will always look at a photo and see it from the top left to the bottom right. It's how we move across a page. We read right to left. Can you guys see my cursor? Okay, just making sure. So when we scan through a scene, we read it like a page in a book. So if you, like I said, if your first language is Arabic, you would actually read it from right to left. And if you speak Japanese, you'll see things top to bottom. And I say it was interesting that there was a couple who spoke Arabic, and we had a really great conversation because they really did see things quite a bit different than we do. So like I said, usually when we go into a scene, we're going to look at that top left corner as we navigate into a scene. And our eyes are going to quickly sweep across the photo. And if we read a page, we would normally, kind of like the old typewriters where we hit the return, we'd go back and start on a new line. But in photography and art, we actually use the techniques I'm going to talk about to redirect your eye and have the viewer focus on parts of the photo that you want them to see. So instead of going back to the next line in this photo, we actually go back to the girls' faces. And one of the reasons that we do that is as people, we really react to other people's faces. It's something that's been instinctual for humans since long before recorded history. So anytime you have a face or something directed at you in a photograph, that's actually one of the few things or first things that you're going to notice in a photo. Another example of that kind of reading from right to left, our eye enters here by I don't want to call it a costume, but the Native American dress here. And immediately we switch. As humans, we see this gaze and our eyes get caught between the interplay between the girl and the man. And we explore the photo that way. Again, here, we're sweeping through the scene. We start off in the top left. And although it's almost a split-second process that your brain goes through, although eventually you'll see these two horses, they're the dominant part of this scene, your eye probably is sweeping across this scene and being drawn to this smaller horse in the background because of the contrast. Another thing with photography, art, anything like that, our eyes are really fixed to seeing high contrast, which is why emergency signs on the highway, other things are black and yellow, is to get us to notice. So on this one, I'm very intentionally with this composition, making you look over at this horse and then start to explore the rest of it. And if anybody has any observations or comments, please unmute yourself. I see there's a chat. I I'm not actually seeing the chat window yet, so feel free to chime in.
Hi, Sean.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
This is Tina. Does it matter if you're left-handed or right-handed? Because I see it from left to right.
Yeah, it's how we read in English. We read from left to right.
I mean,
I'm left-handed.
I see from right to left. See how messed up I am? I see from right to left.
Yeah, some people are going to see something differently. I mean, for everything that there's, when I bring this up, the left to right, it's how most people, most English speakers will enter a visual, either a photograph or a design or something like that. It's really not going to be 100%, but if you're seeing things from right to left, some of these rules will still apply. They'll just be a little reversed. But like I said, I'm left-handed, and there's not really going to be a difference in this between me and somebody right-handed taking a photo. It really is how we're trained to read. So okay, I see you muted, so I must have answered your question. So the first technique I'm going to share with you that I use fairly often in my work is using framing to control the eye flow. So again, this is Dublin Castle Dublin Castle in Dublin, Ireland. And as your eye enters the frame, again, it starts from the top of the page. And because of the contrast, your eye goes around that gate and focuses on the castle behind. And again, this is a very split-second reaction that we see. So you might think you're looking at the entire photograph, but if you, during this presentation, if you kind of look at what I'm showing you and actively think about what your eye is doing, what you notice first, what you notice second, you'll start to see some patterns in how you see these. So eventually your eye is going to wander from this, and you're going to start to see the brick here fading off into the shadow. But the longer you look at the photo, you're still going to be coming back to this middle section here. Here's one that I took in Tbilisi. As you can see it again, your eye is going to come in from kind of this tree. This contrast is really going to pull you in on the street light, and then the cathedral in the background. In your eye is just going to be between this tree, the bottom line, the light is going to be hovering around that. Less obvious, but you can see this is the hole in the rock in Utah. Again, we're going to come in on the top left, and the contrast with the shadow and the rock here are going to hold our eye and circle around with the contrast in the house. This is in Ireland. It's not a perfect circle, but again, I'm attempting to do the same thing and guide the eye to this area of contrast and make your eye just kind of swirl through here for several milliseconds before you start to explore the foliage here in the shadows. The second technique I use, and this is another one that I use extensively when I'm out and about, and you'll see some of these techniques overlapping in my photos and other people's work as well. And that's using lines to control the eye flow. And hopefully in your screens you could see it well, but there's tire marks that go up this dirt road to the church. And subconsciously, again, we're entering through this top left, but using these lines, our eyes want to follow them. So we immediately kind of scan down, and we're following that back into the scene. It's really like having these arrows pointing you back towards this church and the trees. This is a fairly obvious example of using lines to draw you in. This is the Chronicle of Georgia. If anybody attended my talk yesterday, I talked briefly about the Chronicle of Georgia. It's a kind of lesser known monument here, but all these carvings depict the entire history of Christianity through the 3rd century, the different kings and queens of Georgia. It's really an amazing place. But again, when I took this photo, I really wanted to use these stairs to draw your eye up to the Chronicle. And then again, you're going to sweep through, see some of the foreground, explore the columns on the right and left. But if you think about what your eye is doing, it really is going to center around here, because this is where the stairs and the lights are all pointing to.
Sean, I have a question.
Sure.
So it seems like when I'm looking at your photos, I think, when I think about, laying out a piece of graphic artwork or, a poster, is it true that you want to come down like about a third and have that be like the focal point? Because it seems like that's where my eye is going, with almost all of your photographs. It's like it's about a third down from the top.
Hold that thought.
Right. Thanks.
You gave us a sneak peek into technique number 4, I believe. So again, here, this was in Ireland in a place called Glendalough, but with the shadows on the stone stairway here, how they create these lines that basically form a triangle and point up to the dog. And dog faces, for many people like me, are a lot like human faces. You're immediately drawn to that connection with the dog. And then eventually your eyes are going to scan around towards towards the gravestones in the back and the texture in the grass. But for most of us, we really are going to follow this triangular path because of how it's pointed. Again, kind of another hitting you over the head example of using lines. This one, a fairly simple scene, but that bridge going across the little creek is drawing you in and really making you hover in the photo with the trees in the fog. And even though you kind of look away, this really wants to pull you back in. And the reason I'm bringing a lot of this up is when you're out taking photos, either with the camera, with your iPhone or cell phone, that when you're composing, look at the scene and see which elements that I'm talking about that you're seeing in the scene, and then very consciously compose your pictures to be like this. And you'll see almost immediately that your photographs will improve. This is the courthouse in, I want to say Waitrose. It's been a couple of years since I took this picture, but it's in off I-25. But again, using a couple techniques here, some fairly obvious lines pointing into the scene, using the contrast between the lighter cloud. I obviously didn't have any control over the clouds. It just happened to work nicely. But then with the dark branches in these lines here, you're finding yourself just circling in around this cloud. This is my favorite technique in photographs, and that's keep it simple. And a lot of times people will go out to take pictures and they'll want to get everything. They'll see this beautiful mountain range with a barn and this and that, and back up and try to get this entire scene. But when you see it on a 2-dimensional photograph, how many times you come back with a photo and, well, that's not really what I saw. And part of it is you're making the viewer see too much in the photo. Really isolating things, keeping things simple, really having the subject stand out is going to create a more powerful and dynamic photo. Like this one, it's the Bridge of Peace here in Tbilisi. If I would have lowered the camera, you would have seen all kinds of people walking across the bridge, the building behind it, the city. But I very intentionally cropped all of that out just so your eyes focus on the structure itself. This is the Chronicle of Georgia. This is the chapel next to the Chronicle of Georgia. But again, keeping it very simple. There's the subject, the church, you're immediately drawn to it. The clouds, there's no distraction. And again, this is a kind of a tourist destination. There's people walking around. There's no way I'm going to try to get a picture of this and the entire Chronicle. Everything else, you'd have cars in the way. When you really focus in on the subject and keep things simple and avoid that distraction, your photos are really going to pick up after that. This is another one. This is McKetty Church. I had another photo from a different angle of this in yesterday's presentation, but this is another one that if I would have tilted the camera down a little bit, you would have seen a very busy street. In fact, one of the busier streets here in Tbilisi, the river, people walking around. And really, I just wanted people to look at this photo and focus on the stateliness, the kind of quiet majesty of this building. And all that would have been lost if I would have had all the other detail. This no longer exists. This was on the Colorado, New Mexico border, I think just south on I-25. That little picnic table no longer exists, but you immediately know what this photo's about because there's really nothing else to distract you from the subject. And this is the mission at Isleta. This is actually one of my favorite photos and a photo that I'll always say is a very successful keeping things simple. Using the technique, thinking about when your eye comes in on the left and just follows these forms through because of the simplicity of it, the simplicity of the colors, the composition. Your eye wants to go in and explore this texture, explore this detail, and you're not being pulled away from the houses on the other side or other things, the parked cars around. This is the Freedom Square here in Georgia. That's St. George slaying the dragon. Again, this is another one that if I would have tilted the camera down, it's just an incredibly busy square, cars circling around, people honking, walking around. There's hotel chains all through this. It's just a very busy place. But there was something just very quiet about seeing this statue up in the sky. And if I wanted to get the entire statue and everything around it, no one would notice the statue in the photograph. And Julie, we just got to your rule of thirds. So most people start off with the rule of thirds. Like Julie said, it is a very common technique in any visual art. I actually, when I frame photos anymore, I don't even really think about it. I come home and I realize most everything is rule of thirds. And what that is if you divide up your photo or artwork into 3 pieces, to have your main line of interest lie at one of those third markers. And there's mathematicians will explain the golden ratio. There's a reason that we're drawn to compositions like this, but I'm not going to go into it here. But anytime you compose something, try to compose it and then see what is really grabbing your eye and move it into one of those third lines, either horizontally or vertically. And you're going to see all of a sudden there's an interest and kind of you're adding a more dynamic visual to your photo. In this particular one, that third, you see the cross, it's contrasted against the clouds. That is, if I divided that out, that's going to pretty much be right on that third line. This one, people always tell me, well, the church is in the center. And when you take photos and think about the rule of thirds, it's too easy to think that if it's your subject has to be in the thirds. What you're actually seeing a lot in the third is this contrast by the door. And also the contrast with the cross. It depends where your eye goes first in this. But your high contrast areas fall, if not on, very close to those third lines. So don't be fooled when you're taking a photo and you think, oh, it's smack dab in the middle. If there's something that's catching your eye because of contrast or how it's framed, that's what you should be putting into that third line. And again, this is another one. I had a class here, and a woman told me that I centered this again, where the contrast is in this building actually falls on the third, both horizontally and vertically. This is a stone structure in Ireland. You can pay several euros to go see it. And when you first hear about a hinge, you think Stonehenge. Then you just think it was a bunch of people in 10,000 BC who kind of rolled a bunch of boulders, and they've been charging people ever since. But again, that you have kind of a band, this darkness with the trees is pretty much dissecting the photo right in the middle, but where the contrast is, either on the top, the bottom, or on the rocks, is closer to that third mark. It doesn't have to be right on the third mark, like this one is not, but putting it close to those, again, will have a little more a dynamic appeal. This is in Maui. Again, playing with that contrast, the dark of the foreground bushes. Draw a line that's pretty much a third of the way or 2/3 of the way down on the photo. The window here is really what creates that third mark. Again, that contrast between the black and the white in the frame. And this is an example of, I tend to frame things more vertically, but this is one of the few photos that I've done horizontally. And again, where the church is placed, it's that little chapel in Golden between Madrid and Albuquerque. But again, having that point of interest on one of those third lines is going to be much more interesting than if it were just centered. And then this is one of my bonus techniques, and this is my all-time favorite technique, and that's get close. When I talked about keeping things simple, and I said, if you see a scene, don't back up or do anything. Concentrate on what you want the viewers to look at in your photo. And this one really works well with people. And when you get close, it might feel uncomfortable if you're doing it with a phone or something like that to get this close. But when you get close with any scene, you're instantly creating a connection with the viewer to want to go in, explore it a little more. If it's a picture of a human, you feel like you feel an emotional connection to the person that you wouldn't if it were taken from further away. In the next photo, like around Christmas, we still have a little bit of time before the holidays roll around, but I always tell people, think about the holiday photos that you take. Everybody's opening up presents, you back up to try to get everybody in the room together and show everybody's joy. And then you look at it and it's like, well, we all got together, but it doesn't really have that emotional impact. This one I took when I was in high school with my grandmother. It just, like a scene like that, there was probably about 12 of us at my mom's on Christmas Eve, and food, people opening up presents. And this is actually the last photo that I ever took of my grandmother. She passed away a few years after this. But I think about all those photos that you see of the holidays where everybody's running around and there's crowds of people. And it's photos like this that really bring that emotional connection, because you took a step forward. You're really engaging the person with the camera. And that's why this photo, even though it's, I think, 40 years old now, is still one of my all-time favorites. So with that said, I'm not sure what time it is, but I'll open it up to questions. If anybody wants to, again, kind of try out the techniques, if you have a phone, the barcode will go to my email address. You can also send me a photo at sean@seanweaverphotography.com. Kind of tell me in the email what you were trying to do in terms of like the thirds, the using contrast, things like that. Kind of give me a little bit of thought into your, or a little bit of understanding what your process was. And I'll send you I'll reply back and with a little bit of a critique. I'm a nice person. I won't make you cry, but my goal here is to just help everybody enjoy photography a little bit deeper. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions. And yes, Brandon, I grew a mustache.
Sean, I have
That's for a next year talk, Sean. So you can give us like the year-long update at the HU Talks next year. What's it like to live with a mustache?
Okay. Sorry, Manuel.
yes. So I had 3 questions on your carnival scene. That one of the first photos you showed, there
Yeah.
was some blur, and was that intentional? Because normally you would want a high shutter speed. So it appears, I guess, that some of the people were moving around and that caused a little blur.
Yeah, actually, it was very intentional. This was when I worked at the newspaper in Alamos. We had the Sky High Stampede. And after the rodeo, just wandered around the Midway and wanted to try a real slow shutter speed to get the movement. I wanted to really convey what the Midway felt like, that, you go into these places and there's always movement, there's noise. I just set up a tripod, and I think each one of these exposures wasn't too long. I think I want to say it was probably like 1 or 2 seconds. And I honestly didn't notice the girls in the corner until I got back to the newspaper, because I was more worried. I was playing around with the camera and wasn't even really paying attention to the scene. It's when I developed the film and realized that they, I think, just stood there. They wanted their picture taken. It was a kind of a very happy accident, but yes, it was intentional.
Okay, and my second one on that statue with the man on the horse, and I guess on top of the spire. So that was kind of like a rule of thirds thing. So, but why didn't you zoom in a little more for more detail? Was that also?
Part of it, when I saw the clouds, I'm a real sucker for clouds. And you kind of see that through a lot of my photography, that if it's a cloudy day, if it's raining, cloudy, I'm going to go out and get wet. And it just really struck me when I looked up to just how it was kind of contrasted against the soft clouds. And one thing too is, the one thing that I hate, if you go onto YouTube or other things and you look up photography tips, it drives me nuts when people say you have to do this, you have to do this, do this, do this. As I'm sharing these things with you, these are just starting points. If you stood next to me, you would have walked away with a very different photograph. It's how we see things differently. And there's really no right or wrong way to take a photo, but there are ways that you can, work with how our brains work to make a more engaging photo. But to ask why I didn't get closer, it was just a conscious choice. I might actually have some on my computer that that were closer, but this is the one that stuck out for me.
Yeah, so you wanted to focus on the clouds as well. And then
Yeah.
on that one photo of that gentleman where you talked about getting in close, was that with a regular camera or was that with a phone camera?
No, this was with the regular camera. This was actually studio lighting. This was early on. I mentioned my mentor who said, "Have fun, be creative, follow the assignment." This was my mentor from art school. We had a exhibition together at Highlands, I want to say 10 years ago. And I knew that this would be the last time that I'd be able to get a photo of him. So dragged him into the studio, and it's a very formal photograph.
Okay, and my final comment, I like the photo of your grandmother the best. I really like that one.
Thank you. I still choke up whenever I pull it up. And like I said, if I would have just kind of snapped at everything that was going on and trying to catch everything, we would have remembered, oh yeah, grandma was there that year. But when I look at this, this is who my grandmother was. She was a very warm person, and moving in close with the camera and capturing that, even if you don't show anybody else the photos, it's going to create a different memory than just a room full of people. But thank you.
You're welcome.
And Peter?
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about your process? One of the things that I found going from shooting with film to shooting the digital camera is the temptation to take lots and lots of pictures and then sort of cull them to find the ones that work. And
Yeah.
do you work consistently, like setting up and framing, or are there times where you're just kind of going scattershot and seeing something that catches your eye and saying that would be a great photograph, and then taking 36 pictures of it?
Yeah.
The picture in my background right here, this is a picture I shot a couple weeks ago on the road between Taos and Tres Piedras, and there was this
Yeah.
herd of llamas that were just wandering around in the roadway. And so I've just been sort of going through them, and some of them are not so good. Some of them I think are kind of visually interesting, but the one way it seems like it's easier to catch stuff that's spontaneous if you're just shooting and shooting and shooting. But on
Mhm.
the other hand, you end up wading through a lot of mediocre photographs to pick out 2 or 3 that you really like.
Yeah.
At least that's my sort of experience. And so how do you, I mean, what's your process like?
Some of it is, it's kind of a combination. Some of it has been years of internalizing these different techniques where Corey and I were walking through Botany here in Georgia, and I happened to glance over and saw this really neat old rundown apartment building, and just grabbed my camera and click, and we kept walking, and it's one photo that I really like, and it was just a split-second decision to take that, and I didn't bother taking several. And part of that is, and I should have brought this up sooner, is when you kind of start thinking of these different techniques and actively using them when taking a photo, eventually it just becomes internalized. So there's some things that I take that if I just see something, I might walk away with 1 or 2 photos, and it'll be the one that I like. Other times I'll play a little bit more and try more. But even when I photographed with film, I used to take pictures with the 4x5. You certainly don't go through a whole lot of negatives when you're single loading one plate after the next. So some of it I do think about how something's composed, and I'll take some time to do that. But we also, when I was back in art school, we joked that film is cheap, and for starving artists, film really wasn't cheap.
Yeah.
But it was cheaper than having to reset everything or going out to a reshoot. And one year I photographed the Cheyenne Frontier Days for the Greeley Tribune. And each day I left with, I think, 150 rolls of film. And I mean, there were Sports Illustrated guys with just bricks of film. And at the end of the day, I used all of them. So it kind of, it really depends. If you really want to walk away with the photo and kind of explore, take more, because if you can't get back, I think it's
Yeah.
better to take more. But you're right. If you do it all the time, you're going to have the hard drive full of mediocre photos. But again, that goes back to photograph consciously and think about what you're doing instead of just throwing random darts at the board and not really paying attention, to look at something and this is what I want my viewers to see. This is what I remember. How do I isolate it? How do I frame it to get that, and to consciously think about it that way? You're going to be taking less pictures. You over time, as you experiment, you might be taking some more. But I mean, it's funny now. You're right with digital. I usually sometimes I'll go on walkabouts 4 or 5 hours and come back with a couple hundred images that I go through. Other times I come back with about 30. It's very tempting with digital to just keep snapping. So it's a little of both.
Okay.
Deborah?
Sean, I'm just kind of curious, like on this photo of your grandmother, how do you kind of fade the background, or is it just a feature through the crop setting on the camera?
It's actually a feature of the aperture. This was fairly low light, so I wasn't going to get too technical with the camera, but a wider aperture, you have less depth of field, which is a little more advanced technique. But depending on how wide your lens aperture is, you can either have several miles of focus, or on some lenses, literally inches of focus. And as you get closer, that field of focus actually gets smaller as you get closer too. So it's the optics in the camera. And I'm only seeing 5 people on my screen. So if anybody else is raising their hand, just feel free to jump in. I'm not.
Sean, Jeff had a question in chat. It says, do you shoot digital? How do you get the deep blacks in your photos?
I do shoot digital. I stopped shooting film when Corey and I were dating, and she was going to cook something and pulled out a thermometer, and I said, not that thermometer, because it would have poisoned us with photochemicals. So I switched over to digital. Some of it is actually it's all in the processing. Like I said, because I sell it as artwork and as stock. I have about three or four different programs that I use to really hone in on the contrast, get those blacks, get those whites, pull out as much detail as I can, or kind of push detail back. Usually on most photos after I get back, and like going back to Peter's question, the reason I don't like to take too many is on some photos it's not that unusual for me to take a half hour, 45 minutes to really go through and work a digital photo until I'm happy with it. I guess I'm trying to pull up.
Are there other questions for Sean? I just wanted to say, Sean, that this is really, quite generous of you to do this, because you sell your photographs, you have classes, and I'm sure you don't just always give all this information away free. So we're really lucky, and thank you.
I enjoy doing it, and I'm glad everybody showed up. And really, like I said, I've been enjoying taking photos. I got my first, it was a 110 Kodak. I forget what it was called, but just a little pocket camera that I had when I was, I think, 10 or 12 years old. And eventually decided to go to art school for photography. And I've never lost the love of it. And I think sometimes people get so bogged down into the technical aspects of photography that they forget that when you step back and see just a really nice photo that you took or that somebody else took, it really takes you to a different place. And for me, when I see a photo, there's still photographers that will stop me in my tracks, and it's almost like the world goes silent because I'm just enamored with the photo. And it's fun, and it's really, like I said, I go nuts on YouTube when these kind of pompous tech people say you have to do this, and this. No, you have to have fun. Be curious, have fun. That's how your photography is gonna improve.
So Sean, I have another question.
Sure.
You mostly showed black and white photos, so you like black and white photos. So with your digital camera, do you take a color photo, or you set the camera for black and white, or do you process it into a black and white photo afterwards?
Yeah, I take everything in color. I still think in terms of black and white when I used film. My bag was always loaded with Tri-X black and white film or Ilford HP5. So I still, I think because of those formative years, I still see things in terms of black and white. But here in Georgia, a couple of years ago, I was riding my motorcycle through New Mexico and photographing churches and towns. And if you go onto my website, you could see, I think the gallery's Sacred Places. They're predominantly in black and white. But here in Georgia, Tbilisi is a very colorful city. And I found that I've been taking more color photos. And I almost feel bad because I feel like I'm betraying my original black and white. But I start off everything with color. Just both my cameras are set in RAW, so they capture as much detail as they can. Hey, Renee. And then make all the corrections and the adjustments on the computer later. That way you have a choice too.
Sean,
Working
there's
for-
a question in the chat also. What is your process from Manuel? What is your process for setting up a baseline setting for aperture, shutter speed, etc.?
We have 8 minutes. That's more than an 8-minute question. It really depends on how, what the lighting's like, what effect you want on the photo. Like some photos, even in the daylight, I'll use what's called a neutral density filter to increase the shutter speed, the shutter time, so things blur. Other times I want things tack sharp. Manuel, I put my email, sean@seanweaverphotography.com. Send me an email and I can hopefully get more precise with that, because it really is there really is no baseline. It's what you're trying to do. Thanks.
Well, we have another talk that people are starting to come on the screen for, I think. So I hope everybody who's here now will stay on for Joseph Moreno's talk. But in the meantime, Sean, if there are any last minute questions from anybody, we can just roll right into the next talk. So does anybody have anything for Sean?
I do appreciate it. And like I said, please feel free to email me. If I don't get back to you right away, please understand